Level 2 upgrade. Today I'm going to be installing stainless steel RC SCREWZ kit. And yeah, this is going to be a lot of work, but believe me, this is almost a must-have, especially if you want to drive your RCs into water or puddles, mud, anything like that. So let's go ahead and get this started. First things first, I need to go ahead and take off all 4 tires. With those taken care of, it's time to go ahead and remove the front and rear assemblies. So I'm going to flip the RC over. I'm going to start taking off the skid plates. The front bumper is held on with 2 screws, while the front skid plate is held on with 5 screws. So to get the front bumper off, I'm just going to push on this top part and flip it forward, and it should come on out. And it pulled out one of the pins. I'll just go ahead and stick that back in there for now. Then I'm going to get front skid plate, and should pop right up and off. Set that off to the side, and then we're going to swing around to the back. The back is held on with 4 screws. With those 4 screws out of the way, we can go ahead and pull off the rear skid plate, set that off to the side, and move on to the middle. It's only held in with 6 screws, 2 in the back, middle, and front. These 4 holes are the screws that hold in the transmission, and we don't really need to take those out yet. Now we can go ahead and lift up the center skid plate, and we don't have to remove that yet. This is just a little compartment so you can go ahead and reach the center drive line, which I'm surprised is actually plastic and not metal. Oh well, we'll go ahead and set this off to the side, and then we're going to move on to the front bumper. The front bumper is held in with 3 screws. We have these 2 in the front and this center in the back. Then we can go ahead and just grab the front bumper and slide it forward and off. Now I need to go ahead and take off this front cage. This cage that guards the shocks is held in with 2 screws on top, and then we have 4 screws on bottom. 2 on this side, and then 2 on this side. Now we can pull off the front cage, set that off to the side. Then we're going to grab the shocks, swing each one forward, and then we're going to undo these 2 screws. With those out of the way, you can almost take off the front diff. However, we have the servo saver and bell cranks connected up to the servos. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo each one of these screws. Now a quick little trick I should go ahead and mention, it should be obvious, but some people don't think of it, is pull the screw out and then put it back into position. That way you don't mix up your screws, because not all of these are going to be the same length. With those disconnected, you can go ahead and pull off the front assembly, and we'll just set that off to the side. Now it's time to take off the rear. I'm going to start off by undoing this rear shock spring brace. It's held in with 7 screws. We have 2 up front, 2 on the sides, 2 in the middle, and then 1 in the back. So now we can lift this up, pull it off, and then take off the rear wing. It's held in with 3 screws. Now, just like with the front bumper, you're going to grab the wing and jiggle it backwards and pull it off. Next up, I need to go ahead and attach the rocker arms. Each rocker arm is held on with a single screw. With the rockers out of the way, we can go ahead and pop down the rear assembly and then pull it off. Now, it's time to go ahead and set that off to the side. Next up, we need to go ahead and start working on the electronics. First of all, we're going to start off with this massive ESC. It, of course, is held in with 2 screws, 1 on each side. Once those 2 screws are out of the way, I'm going to unplug the ESC. And then you're going to realize you can't pull the ESC off. That's because they have double-sided foam sticky tape holding it down. Once you pry it off, we're just going to go ahead and gently set that down. We're going to move on to the receiver box. We're going to start off by undoing each screw that's on each side. Now we can go and pull off the cap and the seal, set that off to the side, and we finally have access to all the cables. But you'll realize we can't undo everything until we move this giant can of a motor. So I'm going to start off by undoing the gear cover. The gear cover is held on with a single screw. Now we can pop off the gear cover, and then we're going to remove the screw for the motor mount. So we can go ahead and pull off the screw, and then we're going to turn the motor away from the spur gear, and then slide it back. It should come off. There we go. Finally got this giant thing off. Gosh, that thing is huge and heavy. So instead of taking off the wire tie down, what I'm going to do next is take off the servos. Each servo is held on with 4 screws, 2 in the back and 2 in the front. Now I'm just going to grab the servo, twist it and pull it out, and do that for each side. And the last step is to go ahead and take off the receiver box cover by undoing the 2 screws that are inside. Now I can take all the electronics, set that off to the side, and I don't have to remeasure all the wires. Believe me, that's going to save some time putting all this back together. Now we're down to the transmission. We're going to flip it over and we're going to undo these 4 screws. Now before I can pull out the transmission, I need to go ahead and detach the center drive lines from the center. So what I'm going to have to do is undo each grub screw. Now I can pull off the center drive lines. The transmission will fall right on out. Set that off to the side, and now we have only a few more pieces to take off. First I'm going to start off with the servo guards. Each one is held on with 2 screws. Next up, I need to go ahead and take off the shock mounts. Each one is held on with 2 screws found on the bottom. Now, I'm going to open up the battery compartments. And inside, you will find 3 screws that hold on each door. And the last part for the chassis is the battery cool down vents. Each one is held in with 2 screws. And I finally got everything off the chassis and it's ready to be dyed. I'm just gonna go ahead and wash it off and yeah, it'll be ready. However, I do need the rockers as well. So in order to attach each one of the rockers, I need to go ahead and undo 3 screws. I'm gonna start off by undoing the screw that holds it to the push rod as well as a screw that holds on the shock. Pull off the shock, pull off the push rod, and now in order to take this final screw off, you'll see that there is a nut on the bottom. I need to go ahead and grab that with some pliers, and then undo the screw that's on top. Set that all off to the side, slide out this weird thing, and finally I can pull the rocker apart. And I'm of course going to pop off the bearings. But yes, I need to go ahead and dye these black as well. Alright, so the chassis has been dyed black and it turned out pretty good. I'm happy with it, as well as the rockers. So now it's time to go ahead and start putting things on there using stainless steel screws. First up, I'm going to go ahead and reattach all 4 battery vents. With those taken care of, it's time to go ahead and reattach the battery doors using 3 screws each. Next up, I need to go ahead and reattach the shock mounts. With those taken care of, it's time to go ahead and reattach all the electronics. First of all, I'm going to start off with the servos. Now, they don't include these kinds of screws, but they do include normal screws with a washer. Servos taken care of, now it's time for the waterproof receiver box. We have to replace the 2 screws that hold it down, the 2 screws that hold down the wire tie down, and then the 2 screws for the lid. Now it's time to go ahead and reattach the ESC. It's held in with only 2 screws. With that done, I'm going to go ahead and set the chassis aside and move on to the transmission. I'm going to start off by undoing the 6 screws that hold on the spur gear. Now I can go ahead and pull off the spur gear, push down the slipper clutch, slide off this washer, slide out the pen, and now I can pull off the slipper clutch. Now I need to go ahead and switch out these 4 screws. Now I can go ahead and put everything back on. First, I'm going to slide on the slipper clutch, slide the pen in, make sure it's even on each side, then I'm going to slide the slipper clutch up, and get this little cheap plastic washer, and you can see there is grooves on it. I'm going to line that up, make sure that it lines up perfectly, push it all the way down, then slide on the spur gear. And now I can replace these 6 screws. Now that that's taken care of, I'm going to replace the 6 screws that are on the back. Now I can go ahead and reattach this to the chassis. I'm just going to slide it in to the hole, make sure that I'm not pinching any wires, including the servo wire. Make sure that's all positioned right. And then I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the 4 screws that hold it in. Now I can go ahead and reattach the top of the center drive line on each side, as well as replacing the screws for the servo. Now I need to go ahead and reattach the servo cages. Alright, now it's time to go top side. Next up, I need to go ahead and reattach the motor. I'm just going to slide that peg into this hole. Before I seal all this up, I'm going to go ahead and replace this grub screw. With that taken care of, I can go ahead and reinstall the motor mount screw, as well as reattaching the gear cover. With those two being replaced, I can go ahead and set the chassis off to the side and move to the rear assembly. I'm going to start off by removing these 3 screws. Now I need to slide off the rear mount, and yeah, I need to pull off these bottom 2 pins as well as these 2. Slide the A-arms off, and now I can replace these 6 screws. Now I'm going to go ahead and reattach the arms by sliding the pins in and replacing the 3 screws on the back. Alright, so the drive lines are in, the rear camber links are in. Now I need to go ahead and replace the 2 screws at the bottom of the A-arms. We have one that holds in the push rod and the other one for the bottom of the camber link. Now I can go ahead and reattach this to the chassis. Now it's time to move on to the rear wing. We have a ton of screws on this thing. So we have 2 screws for the bumper, 4 screws for the wing mount, 2 on each side. We have another 2 screws for the wing itself, and then another 2 mounting screws in the front. There's 2 more screws that hold in the rear body mount, but as you can see, when I pull them out, they are specialty screws. So none of those are included in this kit, sadly enough. If I have any extras left over, I might replace those. But anyways, I'm going to go ahead and get the rear wing mount. I'm going to slide this lip underneath the chassis but above the dip housing, and then install the 3 screws that hold it in. Now it's time to take care of the rockers. So I'm going to slide this bottom part of the screw mount for the rocker, and then they do include the stainless steel screws that go on the top. Once that's screwed in, I'm going to go ahead and screw this back onto the chassis and then attach it to the push rod, as well as install the shock. Now I can finally go ahead and reattach the rear chassis brace. It's held in with 7 screws. And I'm finally done with the rear assembly. Now it's time to move on to the front. It's a little bit more complicated. I'm going to start off by pulling out the 4 pins that hold in the bottom A-arms. Now I can go ahead and replace the 6 screws that hold in the front dip housing together. Now I'm going to move on to this mount and undo the 2 screws that hold it in. Okay, now I'm going to pull this part back and then replace these 2 screws, and then remount this with 2 brand new screws. Next up, I need to replace these 2 screws, reattach the bottom A-arms, and replace this screw. Now it's time to go ahead and move to the bottom of the A-arms, replace the screw that holds in the push rod, as well as the screw that holds in the turnbuckle. Now I can go ahead and attach the front assembly back onto the chassis by redoing these 2 screws. On the bottom, I need to go ahead and reattach the servos to the servo saver. Next up, I need to go ahead and reattach the front rockers to the push rods and the bottom of the shocks. Now I can go ahead and reattach the shock guard. It's held in with 6 screws, 2 on top and 4 on bottom. Now I can go ahead and reattach the front bumper, which is held in with 3 screws. I'm going to replace the 2 for the front body mount and the 2 for the front bumper. Now on the bottom, I'm going to reattach the middle skid plate, as well as replace this screw. With those 6 screws in, I can go ahead and reattach the rear skid plate, which is held in with 4 screws. Next up, I need to go ahead and reinstall the front skid plate, which is held in with 5 screws, followed by the bumper, which is held in with 2 screws. Now I need to go ahead and slap the tires back on. And now it's time to move on to the body, because it's got screws too. We have 4 to replace on top and front, as well as 4 to replace on top and back. Just like how it was for the servos, it uses these screws in order to hold in the body mounts. Thankfully, they do include some washers that fit in there perfectly. Now on the bottom, I have 9 screws to replace. We have 4 on each side for the main roll cage, as well as 1 center for the switch. Now I can finally say I'm done. Look at all the screws I had to replace, and I still have some left over. There was a couple of screws though that I just didn't have enough of, I was missing like maybe one or two, but thankfully I have so many of these stainless steel screw kits that it didn't really matter because I did have backups. Because as you can see, they always include some extras left over. This was a painful upgrade, but believe me guys, it was worth it. Some of these screws were starting to rust already. They are treated to resist rust, but they don't last that very long. And to top it off, I have to say I love the chassis and the rockers being dyed black. This RC looks so much better. Before I end this video, I have to give a shout out to everyone who helps me out on Patreon. Because of you guys, these upgrades are possible. And that was a level 2 upgrade for JoKer.